I've been busy. I've just invented a time machine, I've given you a stack of cash, and I've sent you back to the year 1972. You get to buy any car you like, and the first thing you think of is the ultimate luxury saloon, the best thing that money can buy. But what do you get? With all the money in the world, you can go for the ultimate in luxury, Rolls-Royce. If you're in America, maybe a Cadillac, the ultimate in luxury over there. What if you're looking for a bit of performance with your luxury? Well, then take a look at the Jaguar XJ. That combines leather seats and wood with great handling and a V12 engine now. But with all the power you get with those cars, if you hit a tree going around a bend in the wet on crappy cross-ply tyres or were rear-ended by a lorry, you were in a lot of trouble. They weren't made to modern safety standards. In fact, no cars were. Cars in 1972 were, compared to cars today, death traps. That is all except one car, the Mercedes-Benz W116, the first car to wear the coveted S-Class badge. It handled like the Jaguar XJ and it had a good level of luxury. And if you were going to drive any car in 1972, this was the one that was least likely to kill you. Why was the 1972 S-Class such a step change from the previous car? How did this large V8 survive in a world that rejected gas guzzlers almost as soon as it launched? And what did its rivals do to react to this threat? This is the 1972 Mercedes-Benz S-Class story. Work on the car that would become the W116 began in 1966, barely a year after the W108 had gone on sale. That's an unusually short gap by Mercedes standards, and it showed that this was to be a major new version, not just a refresh. The brief handed to the engineering department was blunt. Build the best four-door car in the world, better than Rolls-Royce, better than Cadillac, and better than anything Jaguar had in the works. And the way they were going to win was by taking a different tack to all of those competitors. In the USA, one of Mercedes' biggest markets, Ralph Nader's 1965 book Unsafe at Any Speed had cast a long shadow on car companies' focus on style over safety. The public outcry led to political action and the creation of the National Highways Traffic Safety Administration, who started forcing car companies to make safer cars. Most car companies bristled against a new government department telling them how to do their job. They saw crash safety as a regulatory box to tick quietly and then never mention again, worried that talking about crashes might frighten buyers away. Mercedes saw it differently. This push for safety came from a public appalled by the lack of safety features on their cars. Surely it made sense to give the public what they wanted, to make cars even safer than current safety laws. Mercedes competition weren't thinking that way though. Rolls-Royce had just launched the Silver Shadow around traditional coach-built luxury and hushed refinement. Cadillac were working on the gargantuan Series 75 update, chasing sheer size and a soft floating ride. And Jaguar's forthcoming XJ6 was focused on ride and handling above almost everything else. None of them were pouring serious engineering resources into what happened to people inside during the split second of a crash. And in their quest for safety, Mercedes had an ace up its sleeve, an engineer named Bela Bareini. He'd made it his life's work to make cars safer. In 1951, he'd patented what he called the safety body, a rigid, non-deforming passenger cell bracketed front and rear by sections designed to crumple and absorb energy in a crash. You might know it better as a crumple zone. Bareini's safety bodywork had already been used on the 1959 fin-tail W111. He'd fortified the side pillars for the Pagoda SL for rollover protection. He would now help make Mercedes' new top-of-the-range luxury car the safest on the road. Mercedes had also been unusually public about proving their safety claims. Crash testing had been running since the late 1950s, and by the time work started on the new flagship, Daimler-Benz was one of the only manufacturers in the world routinely wrecking their own cars on camera to check the theory actually held up in practice. That culture of testing rather than assuming meant the new flagship didn't just have marketing claims, it had the crash data to back it up. The existing W108 had safety bolted on almost as an afterthought, but the new model, the W116, will be built the other way around. It was one of the first cars where the safety cell came first and everything else was designed around it. Early designs were carried out by Paul Lebrac, but the main job of styling the new car fell to Friedrich Geiger, Mercedes' long-serving chief designer, whose career stretched back to the 500k of 1933. Like Bella Barani, this would be the final car before retirement. For both men, it would be the culmination of their entire career. Geiger took a brand new approach to the new car. The window surrounds were beefed up for rollover protection, sitting on a longer, lower, more horizontal shape with crisp creases running down the flanks. The most obvious design cues, though, didn't come from any previous saloon. It came from the R107 SL Roadster currently being developed. The stacked headlights gave way to a modern horizontal arrangement with indicators on the side so that they could be seen from the front and the side. Again, Mercedes thinking of safety. The larger tail lights were ribbed, not for extra comfort, but to help the lights shed dirt and stay visible in bad weather, a small detail that would remain a Mercedes styling signature for decades to come. Once built, the new flagship wasn't just a German car either. Alongside the main production in Germany, Mercedes also assembled the W116 at its plant in South Africa and shipped it as complete knockdown kits to Venezuela for local assembly there. The new car was noticeably longer and wider than the car it replaced, yet passenger interior space barely grew. That's not just coincidence. All that extra bulk went into the new crumple zones and stiffened roof frame, reinforced door and pillar structures, and a stronger, more resilient passenger cell wrapped around the same amount of room for people. You were paying, in effect, for a bit more car around you whose entire job was to disappear in a crash, so you're more likely to survive. Inside, Mercedes fitted a heavily padded dashboard that sat on a shock-absorbing frame, switches designed to break away or retract rather than impale anyone in a collision, and a new 4-spoke steering wheel with a broad impact-absorbing pad at its centre and a collapsible column, another innovation designed and patented by Bela Barani. Perhaps the single cleverest change, though, was where the fuel tank went. On the previous model and on plenty of rivals, the fuel tank sat very near the rear of the car, right where it was most exposed to a shunt from behind. Mercedes moved it up and forward, tucking it above the rear axle and well clear of all the crumple zones at each end. It made the W116 the first production car in the world engineered this way, and it meant a rear-end collision was far less likely to turn into something a lot worse than a dented bumper. The chassis underneath told the same story. The previous car's old low pivot swing axles, a Mercedes trademark going back decades, were finally retired in favour of a splayed trail arm rear suspension, while up front a new double wishbone layout with anti-dive geometry developed and proven on Mercedes' own C11 experimental prototype kept the nose level under hard braking instead of diving into the tarmac. Power steering, previously an option plenty of W108 buyers skipped, became standard across the entire range. This meant that the large steering wheel on the previous car was ditched for something smaller and more modern. None of that made headlines the way a bigger engine would have, but it's exactly the kind of change the whole car was built around. Nothing flashy, everything aimed at keeping the driver in control and the occupants protected. It also explains why the new S-Class was 180 kilos heavier. The new S-Class was the most comprehensively equipped interior Mercedes had ever put into mass production. Buyers could specify a heated rear window, power windows and central locking. Straight-grained walnut trim ran across the dashboard on higher trim levels, and automatic transmission was of course an option. For all this new engineering, Mercedes still hadn't officially settled on what to call it. Internally, for decades, Mercedes saloons have been informally known as Sonderklasse, German for special class. Journalists and dealers had then shortened that over the years to simply S-Class, but it had never once appeared on a badge, a brochure, or an official press release. With this new flagship, Mercedes made it official. The W116 was formerly branded as the S-Class at launch in 1972. Like Volkswagen calling the Type 1 the Beetle, this was in part Mercedes acknowledging what buyers and journalists have been doing for years. And by giving their flagship model a name, it gave it even more importance. There was a more practical marketing logic to it as well. Rolls-Royce had the Silver Shadow and Cadillac had the Fleetwood. Mercedes equivalent cars had, until now, been sold under nothing more evocative than a string of numbers. Formalising S-Class gave the whole range a single prestige umbrella that could sit above whatever model numbers came and went underneath it. But it's a reason Mercedes will be slow to learn. It would take until 1993 to formalise a naming system across their entire range. Underneath the new name, the model designations themselves followed Mercedes' existing logic. The S stood for Sonderklasse itself, E meant fuel injection or Einspritzung, and the L meant long wheelbase or Lang. But even this produced a little confusion. This meant there was the S, the SE and the SEL models, but the SL model wasn't a long wheelbase S-Class without fuel injection. This was the SL Roadster, the SL letters meaning Sport Light. At least for the S-Class, the numbering system was logical. The 280 was the 2.8 litre 6-cylinder, the 350 was a 3.5 litre V8 and the 450 was a 4.5 litre V8. In 1973, the long wheelbase model added an extra 100mm of wheelbase length that was devoted almost entirely to rear legroom. Some felt that this was the best luxury car. Yes, it may not have the luxury of a Rolls-Royce or a Bentley, but it could get round a corner without spilling your vodka and martini. The Jaguar XJ6 was more the S-Class's best rival. It also had good handling, and Jaguar had just announced a V12 version that trounced the S-Class's V8, at least on paper. But Jaguar didn't have the focus on safety. There wasn't anything from BMW or Audi that came close, but BMW had a plan. And Mercedes wasn't done with safety after the car launched. In 1973, they revealed the experimental safety vehicle 22 based on the 1972 S-Class. The front had lots of plastic designed to improve pedestrian safety. That involved, unfortunately, removing the all-important three-pointed star emblem on top of the bonnet. This concept also focused on improving on protecting the occupants in crashes up to 50 miles an hour. The downside was it added 20% more weight to the car. The 1974 ESF 24 got even better pedestrian and occupant safety with only a 10% weight penalty. These experimental vehicles were shown to the public at shows around the world. The message was clear: Mercedes was serious about safety. Not serious enough though, at least for US regulators, because even though the S-Class was arguably the safest car on the road, Mercedes were forced to add small rubber protrusions to their existing bumpers. They'd soon have to grow even larger. Barely 13 months after launch, the world handed Mercedes a problem that nobody in Stuttgart had planned for: the 1973-1974 oil crisis that quadrupled oil prices. A thirsty saloon was the last car that people would want, surely. Mercedes couldn't exactly slot a 1.6 litre 4-cylinder into the almost 1.5 metric ton car. It would get overtaken on the Autobahn by a Vespa. The company did what they could, focus on the smaller 6-cylinder 280 model, bringing it to the US market as an option for the first time. They also began development of a turbo diesel. But in reality, S-Class sales didn't see much of a change. It seems that the people who could afford an S-Class could also afford expensive petrol. Worldwide sales in 1973 were almost 69,000. They were a little higher in 1974. And the fuel crisis didn't dent recognition of what Mercedes had actually built. In 1974, the S-Class was named European Car of the Year, a genuinely remarkable result for a large, expensive flagship saloon going up against smaller, cheaper, more relevant everyday cars. It was proof that the gamble on safety and engineering integrity over outright flash had paid off. Mercedes had also had to contend with American emissions rules that forced catalytic converters onto US markets from 1975. Mercedes spent much of the decade quietly re-engineering the S-Class underneath its unchanged bodywork, for example with updated K-Jetronic fuel injection across the entire V8 range. Oil crisis and regulations be damned, Mercedes needed a car to compete with Jaguar's XJ V12 for those who still wanted a luxury car with opulent power. And they'd been working on one ever since the 1960s. They transplanted the M100 engine, expanded to 6.9 litres into the S-Class, giving it bags of torque and a 0 to 60 time of 7.4 seconds, just pipping the Jaguar XJ12. Mercedes had thought of killing development during the oil crisis, but correctly assumed that demand for large engines would eventually return, and in any case most of the development work had already been completed. Development stalled for 18 months, but the 6.9 litre V8 model was put on sale in 1975. It was a great car, but it had an odd numbering system. Mercedes, as was their wont, broke their own naming convention. Instead of logically calling it the 690, it was called the 450 6.9. Is it any wonder people get so confused over Mercedes naming schemes? The 450 6.9 got Citroën-like hydropneumatic suspension with level control as well. It had a much smaller range of height movement, just 5 centimeters instead of Citroën's 50 centimeters, so there was no sinking down to the ground and time taken to spool up when the ignition was turned on. Reviewers were impressed at how this made the already good S-Class suspension even better. The S-Class got even more luxury with cruise control and a more sophisticated optional air conditioning system, and a year later got full climate control. Both cruise control and climate control were a real novelty at the time. It would take Audi 3 years until 1978 to offer cruise control on the Audi 100 after promising it in 1977. Cruise control in particular was useful for long US road trips with a plodding 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. It wasn't the first car to get climate control though, as the auto climate control system was adapted from a Chrysler design. After all, Chrysler had pioneered cruise control in the 1950s. By the time the 6.9 arrived, the wider press had thoroughly made up its mind about the standard S-Class. Road testers across Europe and North America kept landing on the same conclusion. This wasn't necessarily the most exciting or the most opulent car in its class, but it was consistently praised as the most reassuring, the one engineered with the least regard for cutting corners anywhere that mattered. That reputation translated directly into sales. The S-Class sold strongly not just in North America, but across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. With such a large range of engine, suspension and prestigious luxury, why pick another car? The S-Class had it all. Well, maybe not. BMW wanted some of the action and had been actively working on a rival that launched in 1977, the BMW 7 Series. It was a worthy first effort, but Mercedes still held the crown. Back in 1973, Mercedes had given a high priority to a turbo diesel, an engine that could potentially save the company if fuel prices remained high, or heaven forbid there were more price shocks at the petrol pump. The engine, developed again using the C11 research car, arrived as the 5-cylinder 300 SD in 1978, the first series production car with a turbocharged diesel engine and the first diesel-powered luxury car. It was sold exclusively in North America and let Mercedes keep selling a proper big Mercedes for those that cared about fuel prices, especially after a second oil shock in 1979. The ESF experimental safety vehicles showed Mercedes was committed to making its cars the safest on the road, and they kept developing safety features they could add to the S-Class. The next was anti-lock braking, developed in conjunction with Bosch. It wasn't the first ABS system. The history of ABS goes way back to the start of the 20th century, but the S-Class introduced a practical, reliable electronic ABS system that would continue to save lives. It's easy to dismiss ABS today when it's on almost every new car, but in 1978 this was new territory, a system that could sense a wheel was about to lock under hard braking and release, and then reapply pressure to the wheel dozens of times a second, letting the driver keep steering control while stopping as hard as the tyres would allow. It was exactly that kind of quiet, unglamorous engineering that the whole W116 project had been built around. The partnership behind this mattered too. Bosch had been developing electronic anti-lock braking systems since the early 1970s, but earlier attempts on other manufacturers' cars had proven too crude, too slow, or too unreliable for serious production. Mercedes and Bosch kept refining the system together for years before it was judged good enough for Mercedes to sell. Within 2 years, it was available across the entire Mercedes range, and in the 1980s, every serious manufacturer in the world was racing to put it on their car. A feature that started life as an expensive option on the top-of-the-range Mercedes is today standard equipment on the cheapest car. Production continued until 1980 when Mercedes presented the next generation S-Class, the W126. But the 1972 S-Class had done its job. It had redefined safety in a modern luxury car. It had not only survived the oil shock, it had thrived because it was a car that customers wanted. Mercedes was right, customers wanted to pay for safety. That would be borne out in the 1980s and beyond as car companies rushed to catch up to what the S-Class was offering and pass all important crash safety tests that the public used to decide which car they wanted to buy. But Mercedes knew people wanted the whole package. They also wanted luxury and gadgets, and the S-Class had plenty of those. That meant sales for such a high-end car were pretty respectable, 473,000. But what all this development gave Mercedes was features that they could simplify and put on lower models like the new C-Class that launched in 1982. The W126 had the foundation to build on because the W116 had already done the hard, unglamorous work of arguing that a flagship saloon's job was to protect the people inside it as rigorously as it pampered them. Every S-Class since carries that same argument forward, wrapped in whatever new sheet metal happens to be fashionable at the time. It's no wonder the Sonderklasse badge has endured to this day and remains the standard against what other cars are judged. In 1989, Toyota decided to make a car that would crush the S-Class, the Lexus LS. Did it succeed? Well, watch the whole story on the right. Thanks for watching to the end, and I'll see you in the next video.